In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We have come now in this period of the Nativity Fast to that place where we began having these series of weekends that lead up to Christ's Nativity itself. Of course, these 2 weekends prior, we celebrate the Holy Forefathers of the Lord, and the next one, the Fathers. There are many similarities with some differences. The next week, we primarily deal with the genealogy. This week, we have those who not only were ancestors according to the flesh, but also those who prophesied and lived a life, of course, pointing to the life of Christ. I heard a story recently from, many of you know Dr. Albert Rossi, but I heard a story he was telling. I consider him a friend, but this is a good story. He said that one time he found himself coming back from an event with his family. He was sitting in the back of a van with one of his grandchildren. And they were having a good time together, playing around with the phone and various things. And he said that the grandson looked at him at some point and said, "Papa, do you love me more or God?" And he said in his normal humanity, his comfort zone had been cracked there. He was enjoying his comfort and fun for the day. So he looked at him and he said, "God." And he seemed to accept that fairly well at the time, as much as a young child could. And so he said he had a teaching moment at that point that he didn't expect to have, a very important teaching moment. And that, I know I too have been asked that question before, and sometimes it comes as a shock to children when you say God. And he had other people tell him, "Well, you shouldn't have said that. You should have said him, you're the apple of my eye and the greatest thing in the world and all this." But he said that wouldn't have been true to the gospel at all and what the Lord teaches us. So later on, he said he found himself staying at their house at one point. And he said he was going to take this opportunity to go a little farther with him. He looked at his grandson and said, "Who do you love more, me or God?" And this child hesitated. The child doesn't want to say that. It's very terrifying to say what he needed to say. He said, "What do you want me to say, Papa?" And he finally said, "I want you to say God." And he said, "God." Then God. So he said he uses a teaching opportunity, but he said he was going to expound on it later and take this farther. Why this was so. Why this needed to be so, that God had to come first. We know the scriptures. He who loves father or mother or brothers or sisters or wives or children or lands more than me is not worthy of the kingdom of heaven. Well, he had an opportunity at this point to say that. In the epistle we just heard, in the epistle to the Hebrews, many people who had to put that really to the ultimate test of throwing their bodies into the hands of this world to be brutally killed for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. They had the opportunity to say, "What do you love more, your comfort or God? Do you love me?" As he says to Peter. He gets to ask that, "Who do you say that I am?" This is asked at this point. And these people today in the parable that we probably know well, I hope we know well, but need to hear it many times, have legitimate excuses. They had good reasons. All these things are worthy ultimately of a blessing. The Lord does give us land. The Lord does give us oxen to use and things for our tasks. The Lord does give us spouses, God willing, and at least significant people in our lives. These are not bad things. But these people were called to the test that Dr. Rossi was called to. Who do you love more, God or that? The land which you think that you possess, but actually possesses you, because you allowed it to take you away from God. You are a slave to that which possesses you. The oxen are okay, you need to do your work, but people who are workaholics and don't make room for God, it's the same thing. Who do you love more, God or your work? The work will still be there. God will too. And God will eternally be there. And the wife, this is worthy of a blessing. But what does a marriage mean without the presence of God? It means absolutely nothing. Because the point of marriage is to guide two people to the kingdom of heaven together. The purpose of monasticism is the same thing, for a community of brothers to guide each other to the kingdom of heaven. And the purpose of a parish is that same thing. Without the presence of God, just coming together and talking doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't. You can do that in secular circles. So these people had seemingly good excuses, but it cast them out. So he sent his servants out. The beauty, there's many beauties in this parable. One of the great, beautiful things is the Lord in his mercy keeps going out and asking for others. He doesn't stop seeking us ever. No matter where we are, notice he comes to where we are. And some of these people were in very bad places, the halt and the maimed. These are people that truly needed help. But that is us. And we think we're going to wait till the day where we're ready for God to meet us, and we're going to change to that place where God will meet us, but that's not the way it works. The way it works is God meets us in our humility. Look how he came, humbly, as a servant, as one who would ultimately be crucified and descend into hell for us. Go all the way down to hell to pull us back up. When he goes out and seeks those people who are weak, he even goes down into Hades to pull them out, as we see in the resurrectional icon. So the Lord is doing everything he can to bring us into his presence. So when he invites us to the feast, we need to come. Every time that he calls us, we need to come. Now some will ask, well, does that mean I need to come to communion every time? Well, ideally, yes, absolutely that means that. But remember the version in Matthew where someone came in without the white garment on, the wedding garment, and they were cast out. So we do need to have our wedding garment preserved. We do need to be repenting and going to confession and living the life. It can't just be a whim. Our life needs to be dedicated to Christ. But why do we not do this? Well, psychologists have these terms they use like repression and addiction. We all have that. Whether you believe it or not, you are addicted to something. I know I'm addicted to things. There are things that our heart's attached to, that our desire, which is a good thing. It's a appetitive part of the soul that God put within us. But it becomes attached to something that's not of God. And it starts to always seek that out instead of God. When I feel bad, when I feel low, when I feel tired, when I feel sad, when I feel angry, well, I'll watch the TV, or I'll get on the computer and surf for hours, or I'll, God forbid, look at pornography, or I'll drink, or I'll become greatly angry, or whatever it is. And those things are never going to fill your heart up. Some of them are terrible, some of them are maybe somewhat innocuous, but none of them are going to fill your heart up with joy, ever. It will be empty afterwards. The only thing that can fill the heart is Christ. That shape in the heart that is empty whole is shaped to fit Christ to sit in that place. That is his throne. Nothing else goes in that throne. When we cover it over and cover it over, it's still there, but we can scrape it off and clean it up. The repression that we exercise that I mentioned is when we are afraid to get hurt. We try to love and we get hurt. And so we just push that feeling away. We refuse to try to love because it hurts too much. Love is a risk. And loving God, as Metropolitan Anthony says, to pray to God is to make ourselves vulnerable, to be quite vulnerable. But is that not what Christ does with us? Christ came and became extremely vulnerable to the point of death for us. So we must make ourselves vulnerable to him. And this list of fathers, we could go for day after day after day, as fathers have done, writing about these, this icon and women and many others that we read about in the canon last night. But Abraham becomes the prime example. Abraham had land. Apparently he had quite a bit of money. He was doing quite well. He had a family. He had many animals. He had plenty of things to stay in his land for. But when God came and said, Abraham, come to the feast, Abraham went without question. Left everything that he knew, everything that he knew. He made his mistakes along the way, but he kept following. He kept following. And ultimately he got called to the test that I hope none of us get called to. When he got asked, Papa, do you love me or God more? He went to sacrifice Isaac immediately. Of course, God stopped him. God's not going to let us do something like that. But he will put us to the ultimate test. He will break our bones if it requires that to bring us into the kingdom of heaven. He is constantly knocking at the door out of his love for us. He desires us to open and walk with him. Daniel and the three youths, Ananias, Azarias, and Mishael, they followed. They were in a land. They had many things promised to them, a little bit more illicit things because they involved idolatry. But they refused to follow that. Daniel refuses to follow and to bow down before paganism. And what happens? He's cast into a lion's den. And what happens? They fawn at his feet because he is a man of prayer, but willing to give himself over to this. He was a great man. A beautiful story in his life in this fast is, of course, he refused to eat the foods from Nebuchadnezzar's table, and he challenged the people because they were worried about this to allow him to eat pulse and water for 10 days and see which one turned out better. Well, he became fairer looking than the others, and they realized that something was special about this man. But fasting doesn't kill us, keep that in mind. It makes us more beautiful in the eyes of God, actually, especially done for the right reasons. And so, the three youths are cast into the furnace. We know the famous story. It becomes an image of this nativity. It becomes an image of the Theotokos, who is that womb that contains God that is not burned, the flames burning up within it. And while they're doing this, while they're chanting the hymn of praise that we hear on Holy Saturday, what are they doing? They're repenting of their sins. They're exercising humility and their unworthiness, repenting for the people and repenting for themselves. And that's when the angel of great counsel appears. That's when the pre-incarnate Word, the pre-incarnate Christ appears, as we see in the icon. That is the angel of great counsel. Christ is with them. Christ is in the furnace for us. And Nebuchadnezzar sees and sees us, behold one as the Son of God. Nebuchadnezzar even becomes a prophet in seeing this, because his eyes see that these men who were faithful to God, who did not love the king more than they loved God, were willing to give their lives. And of course Moses, who had to leave what he knew in Egypt, everything good that he knew, to take off in the wilderness. But then, when he's quite comfortable in the wilderness, is when the burning bush episode happens. And he calls Moses to do something he does not want to do. I can't speak. Well, Aaron will speak for you. Constant excuses. But the Lord is intent on bringing him with him and to guide his people. So as I've said many times, the Lord knocks and he knocks and he knocks, as Elder Emilio Nos says, and he knocks and he knocks and he knocks until your very death. He knocks gently. He's not hammering on the door. Sometimes he hammers a bit, as he did with Paul. Sometimes he hammers, but most of the time he gently knocks. But we have to be willing for a few minutes of our every day to be quiet enough to listen to God. Not just to talk at God, but to listen to God. Not just to say reams of words, but to listen to his very presence in our life, because he will speak to your heart. Believe me. And what he says, those things that constantly come up in the conscience, I advise you to do. I know the many times that I don't. He'll keep knocking vehemently until I finally say, yes, Lord, be it according to thy will, and force myself to do whatever it is. Because that's the way that Christ begins to walk intimately with us and enthrones himself again in our hearts. Sits with us, how we come to know God, truly know God with knowledge, to follow his ways, to not make excuses, to be vulnerable, not to repress our love for him, to get away from our addictions, because when we're tied down to them, we need someone to untie us, and he will do that. But we have to surrender to him, to not make excuses. And whatever comes up in our lives, and we know they're going to come up in this next week, we know they're going to come up this afternoon, they're going to come up in the liturgy with our thoughts, the logizmi that fly through our heads. Whichever one of you, Father Cyprian, whoever, do you love this, or do you love God? Make your choice. Because everything and every minute of our day needs to revolve around that choice, with God at the center. Do we want to move toward God, or do we want those things more? Some of those things are blessed with God in them, but not without God being a focus of them. Our heart has to be constantly with God, walking with God. So brothers and sisters, don't make excuses. Follow God beyond all else, and you will regain paradise and return from exile and be able to walk with the Master in Eden. Amen. Amen.